see through so that you can see the entire complex of the Louvre.
Through the labyrinth of courts and corridors, the public fans out to find the objects of desire, the sources of cultural capital, the magic artifacts whose intellectual ownership confers prestige and power. This is what we've come to see: art. What are these people doing here? What are they looking for? A disturbing masterpiece by Michelangelo? Or an occasion for courtship? Are they interested in the Venus de Milo as an example of late Hellenistic Greek art, or as an icon of feminine beauty recognizable from 20th century popular culture? Are they here just to say they've seen the Mona Lisa, or to evaluate it as an example of an early Renaissance portrait? How does the museum and the authority behind the museum guide their quest and manage the cultural exchange? What sort of transaction is being managed here? Well, part of the deal I get from going to a museum is to get some culture, to confirm my claims of sophistication. Part of being cultured seems to involve knowing about art, being able to identify and give some account of the most beautiful and significant works. But who decides which the most beautiful and significant works are? Can I make up my own mind on the matter, or do I have to accept the judgments handed down by museum curators and experts? These women are clearly absorbed by Cimabue's altarpiece of the Virgin and Child. But are they in a position to make up their own minds, or are their judgments determined by what the curators are telling them? The people who selected these things, the tastemakers, if you like, have been making their choices over thousands of years. These antique statues have been copied, collected, bought and sold since antiquity. And this long process adds its own authority, an authority which tells us to admire these works not only as antiquities, but also as examples of beauty. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the selectors were kings and their advisors, choosing or commissioning paintings for personal reasons. Alternatively, they were commissioned as propaganda statements to make a point or impress visitors. Others were archaeologists or art historians, primarily interested in understanding past cultures. Later, especially after 1800, there were professional museum curators trying to fill out the collection, as if to illustrate the pages of a history of art. The dealers offering the fruits of a lifetime's taste to the nation. Now, the argument runs that what finished up in the Louvre as a result of this process of selection was part of what is known as the canon of art, an authoritative selection of paintings and sculptures. Now, we don't have to accept this received opinion, but we can try and find out how these judgments were made and why. Now, my approach is going to be to ask a series of questions of the Louvre, the kind of questions that you yourself might ask the next time you visit a museum or art gallery. Let's start with the physical context of the museum. How did the present buildings of the Louvre come about? The origins of the Louvre were as a fortress guarding the westward approaches to Paris along the river. The medieval Louvre, with its picturesque towers and massive bulk, came to represent a symbol of the royal power in Paris, holding out against revolts. The remains of this old Louvre, lost for 400 years, have been excavated and now form part of the new Louvre. Today's museum not only displays its collection of art, but also its own history. When Francis I decided that his old fortress needed humanizing, the first bit to go was the round donjon, the keep. In 1546, just before he died, he replaced the west side of the castle courtyard with a wing in the new Italian Renaissance style by the architect Pierre Lescot. Inside, the new wing offered elegant, classicizing staterooms like this one, now known as the Hall of the Caryatids. Many dramas in French history unfolded in this room while it was still part of the royal palace. By 1590, a new wing had been added, leading down to the walls on the riverbank. A new palace had also been built outside the walls to the west, called the Tuileries, after the tile ovens in the area. A grand plan developed to link up the partially built Louvre to the new palace with long wings on both sides. One of these was built, but it would take another 250 years before this project was finally completed. The long gallery along the river, always known as the Grande Galerie, was nearly a kilometre long, crossing the city walls and moat. The scale of the Grande Galerie is still astonishing. From this woodcut, the state of the Louvre and the Tuileries under Henry IV can be grasped, with parts of the old fortress still standing. The fortress was then demolished, and under Louis XIII, a start was made to extend Francis I's wing into a great square court, the Cour Carrée. Although the completion of the Cour Carrée took over a century, the original style of Lescaut's 16th century wing was generally respected. In the 1660s, the main problem was the construction of the east facade, intended to present an imposing front to the city and to house a grand new suite of rooms for Louis XIV. Work was still unfinished when, in 1674, Louis XIV decided to move his court out of Paris to the Palace of Versailles. Following the French Revolution in 1789, the palaces of the Tuileries and Louvre took centre stage in events. With the king a prisoner in the Tuileries and eventually executed in January 1793, the palace was declared a national monument and part of the Louvre given over to a central museum of the arts. Napoleon commissioned his architects to complete the grand plan, but it was left incomplete until Napoleon's nephew seized control of the government in 1851, subsequently declaring himself Emperor Napoleon III. By 1866, the Louvre was finally complete, with the enclosure of the whole palace and the construction of 2 new wings. Napoleon III made the Louvre and Tuileries into a single enormous building of state, housing suites for himself and his family, as well as ministry buildings, state meeting rooms, several museums and academies. It all ended badly, of course, with the disastrous Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. Napoleon's defeat and exile, and the Paris Commune of 1871, in the course of which the Tuileries and several other buildings of state were gutted by fire. The ruins of the Tuileries stood for 10 years, but in the end this royal palace was pulled down. And this is how the Louvre remained, for 100 years, in gentle decline. The museum shared the buildings with the Ministry of Finance and several other state institutions, until, in September 1981, President Mitterrand announced the plan to dedicate the whole building to the museum. This project came to be known as the Grand Louvre. The Ministry of Finance was moved out to a new building at Bercy. Perhaps if you think that this is how the Louvre might have been redesigned by a modern architect, the question of tradition and continuity comes into focus. By comparison, the pyramid designed by the American architect I.M. Pei is an exceptionally discreet external expression of an enormous transformation inside and underground, where thousands of cubic meters were excavated to make space for the new museum.
I remember when I went to the Louvre back in 1951, that was my first experience with the Louvre. There were only 2 little toilets in that huge museum. And you don't find it. One simply did not find those things, you know. So it didn't function as a museum. So the museum brief was a very, very important one. And in order to make it work as a museum, a very major intervention has to take place. When I met Mr. Mitterrand, President Mitterrand at that time, I told him, yes, I say something could be done to make it function well as a museum, but we have to dig under Napoleon Court. And that was the first step. Now, if he, at that time, told me, Mr. Pei, I don't think that is possible, and then I would have said, then I'm sorry, there's nothing could be done. But he was very understanding. He said, I can understand what you meant. Very well, let's try.
Now here's a puzzle. When we the British cut off the head of our King Charles I, he had the finest collection of paintings in Europe. But Oliver Cromwell sold them off, and pretty soon most of them found their way through the dealer network into the collection of Louis XIV. So most of these paintings are not in a British museum, but in the Louvre. But when the French put their king, Louis XVI, to the guillotine in 1793, they decided to form a national art museum out of the royal collection. Why? Well, it's a complicated story. The revolutionaries knew that there had to be a complete break with the age of royal tyranny. On the other hand, they considered it the right of free men and women of France to have access to the great works of art of the past. So, how was the collection formed, and to what extent was its nature conditioned by royal patronage? Some of the most famous paintings in the Louvre were collected by Francis I. He commissioned this portrait of himself from the Venetian artist Titian in 1537. Now, was it just that Francis had a good eye? He also acquired Raphael's La Belle Jardinière, painted in 1508, now generally considered one of the most important works in the Louvre. He kept his favourite paintings in an intimate part of Fontainebleau, the bathrooms, where he could enjoy them in the company of his mistresses and closest courtiers. Once in the collection, however, paintings like these became a valuable asset, which could be shown off to visiting dignitaries as a sign of the king's culture. This painting by Andrea del Sarto, the Italian painter, was done in France in 1518 for the king. The subject is an allegory of charity, a virtue which wealthy kings could hope to acquire. Paintings could flatter a king and make him seem powerful. Across the Grand Gallery, a painting of St. Michael and the Dragon by Raphael was commissioned by the Pope as a gift for Francis I. Now, as Grand Master of the Order of St. Michael, Francis had a particular interest in this warlike angel. Leonardo da Vinci also came from Italy to France, where the king gave him his own chateau and is thought to have brought with him the most famous painting in the Louvre, the Mona Lisa. It's popularly said that Leonardo died in Francis's arms. Raphael, Titian, Leonardo, these were among the most famous living artists in Europe. In other words, what Francis was collecting was, at the time, modern art. It's a remarkable thing that Francis's judgment has held up, and these works have been valued as central to the canon of art, not only by subsequent royal patrons, but also by their revolutionary and republican successors. The paintings collected by Francis I formed the core of the most prized selection of works, which were displayed in the Salon Carré from 1840 onwards. In the Salon Carré were also paintings that had originally belonged to Charles I of England and had been acquired by Louis XIV. With their secular subject matter and sensuous treatment, some of these works were specifically designed to whet the tastes of secular patrons. Titian's Fête Champêtre had originally been in the court of the Gonzaga in Mantua, when, in 1627, a large part of the Gonzaga collection came came to England. Here is another one that came by the same route. Correggio's Venus, Satyr and Cupid, often wrongly called The Sleep of Antiope. Painted in 1524, it passed through Charles I's collection and then via Cardinal Mazarin to Louis XIV. Francis I was also a keen collector of antique sculpture. He had this antique statue of Diana repaired. We can see that Diana was originally holding a bow, but the restorer added a deer to make associations with Francis's favourite sport, hunting, even more obvious. In the next century, Louis XIV's wealth and power allowed him to extend the royal collection of antique sculptures. An antique type much favoured by the court was the crouching Aphrodite. This is one that was discovered in Vienne, in France, in the 17th century. The king's collection of antique sculptures provided models for his artists. This sculpture was commissioned by the king for Versailles in 1685 and was signed by Quasvaux with a signature in imitation of Phidias, written in Greek lettering. So, how did royal patronage promote art practice? Now, part of the point of collecting antique and Renaissance art was to train up artists to use their skill in the service of the crown. From 1600, for 200 years, the king's painters were given lodgings in the Louvre. In 1648, the Royal Academy of Painting was founded to give these artists a proper training, and this too was housed in the Palace of the Louvre. Artists received into the Academy were guaranteed a job for life. A key part of the training were the lectures administered by the academicians evaluating and explaining paintings in the royal collection. For example, on the 7th of May, 1667, the king's first painter, Charles Lebrun, lectured on Raphael's St. Michael and the Dragon, praising Raphael for his composition, for his depiction of a human body as if motivated by the divine spirit. A month later, the painter Philippe de Champagne chose Titian's Entombment, a recent acquisition by Louis XIV, this time praising the Venetian artist's use of colour and light and shade. Philippe showed how Titian had daringly cast a shadow over Christ's upper body and head, while dramatizing the tragedy of Christ's death by illuminating his lifeless legs and feet. Comparing the skills of different artists at composition, drawing, colour, and expression became a staple form of debate, which informed current art practice. An amateur painter and critic, Roger de Pile, even drew up tables of scores out of 20. This set the cat among the pigeons, since he was a fanatical fan of the Venetian colourists and of Rubens. In 1622, Rubens had been commissioned to paint a cycle of huge paintings commemorating the achievements of Marie de Medici, mother of King Louis XIII. Compared with most French artists, Rubens commanded a hugely expressive range, a vibrant use of colour, and an acute observation of the body. For composition and expression, de Pile awarded Rubens 18 and 17 out of 20, equalled only by Raphael, while for colour he gave a mark of 17, only bettered by the Venetian artists Titian and Giorgione. Only for drawing did he mark him down to 13. By contrast, the French painter Nicolas Poussin, who spent most of his working life in Rome, was admired for his knowing references to antique sculpture and reliefs. De Pile gave him 17 for drawing and 15 each for composition and expression, but only 6 for colour. Nevertheless, it was following Poussin's erudite example that French academic art aspired to emulate and outdo the Italian Renaissance. Charles Lebrun, the king's first painter, spent 3 years in Italy with Poussin and tried to learn from this master's style. French painters and critics returned to the comparative analysis of Poussin and Rubens for the next 150 years. It's notable that an artist actively involved in the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David, should have chosen to paint in a style heavily influenced by Poussin and antique sculpture. His version of the Sabine women, which depicts the women trying to stop their Roman husbands from fighting their Sabine brothers, is as cold as a Roman marble frieze, but packed with emotional power. By contrast, Eugène Delacroix in the 1820s borrowed heavily from Rubens in his use of colour and dramatic composition. He closely studied Rubens's Marie de Medici cycle. So, having ready access to these works in the royal collection formed the basis of an artist's education. Just as artists like Poussin studied the antique, so painters later were to study Poussin, Rubens, and the Italian artists of the Renaissance. Under Louis XIV and his ministers, there was a symbiotic relationship between the collection of antique and Renaissance art, the development of artistic education under the Royal Academy, and regular employment of the best artists in public commissions for the king. When carried out with vigour and conviction, these 3 strands of royal policy produced great advantages for the king as a form of propaganda celebrating the king's achievements. It also formed the tradition of high art, which could be handed on to later generations.
An important part of the painter's or sculptor's education remained the trip to Rome, as pensionnaire of the French school. Young painters and sculptors were sent there by the Royal Academy to copy the best examples, and this was all part of the process of preparing painters and sculptors for work in the king's service. Among the young sculptors who studied in Rome were the brothers Nicolas and Guillaume Coustou.
L'Académie et le séjour à Rome, et là à Rome c'est le grand contact avec l'antique. Nicolas Coustou copie le Gladiateur Borghese, copie l'Hercule Farnèse, donc les grandes collections qui sont alors à Rome. Et de retour en France, ils s'insèrent dans les grands chantiers royaux. Ils accomplissent la carrière de l'Académie, la carrière au plus haut niveau. Ils sont agréés académiciens, reçus académiciens, chacun avec un morceau de réception, c'est-à-dire ce qui est un chef-d'œuvre, comme dans l'ancienne corporation, le chef-d'œuvre, mais qui en même temps est une opération d'exaltation du souverain. Et le morceau de réception de Nicolas Coustou, c'est l'image d'Apollon qui dévoile le buste de Louis XIV sur un modèle de Lebrun, donc totalement inséré dans le système de l'art de cour.
Among the notable works of Nicolas' younger brother Guillaume are these horse tamers, loosely based on the famous sculptures placed on the Quirinale Hill in Rome. But you didn't have to follow the traditional route to receive royal patronage. The sculptor Puget began his career carving figureheads in the naval dockyards in Toulon. His reputation spread, and the king gave him 2 great blocks of marble to fashion as he pleased. This is a most unusual subject. Alexander the Great, on whom Louis XIV modelled himself, had gone to see the great philosopher Diogenes, who lived naked in a barrel. When Alexander and his retinue arrived, he asked the philosopher how he could help him, and Diogenes replied, "Just get out of my light." Now, since Louis XIV also represented himself as the Sun King, this is a potentially treasonous representation. In the other great block of marble, Puget attempted a great and terrible episode from classical legend. It represents the antique athlete Milo of Crotona, who in his old age tries to tear a tree down with his bare hands. His fingers are trapped, and he's attacked by a lion. This work has always been seen as a key piece in the royal collection of French sculpture. Puget's unconventional career and troubled personality allowed him to be presented as a heroic genius in the mould of Michelangelo. When the entrance hall of the new museum was decorated in 1800, Puget's Milo is shown as the representative of French sculpture, to be compared with Michelangelo's Moses, the antique Apollo Belvedere in Rome, and the Colossus of Memnon in Egypt. In designs for frescoes decorating the 19th century Louvre, the Milo crops up again and again as a talisman for the supremacy of French sculpture. This portrait of the king's first painter, Charles Lebrun, in a sense sums up the whole career of a successful official artist. On the table is an engraving of his painting, The Tent of Darius. It was this painting which so impressed the king that he took him on as court painter. The portrait also shows Lebrun's classical training. We can see a bronze statuette of the Borghese gladiator, very like the one Nicola Custu made in Rome 2 years before this portrait was painted. Custu had copied it from the famous life-sized bronze Hellenistic statue which was then in Rome. Doing studies of this kind was how young artists developed their skills. Behind it are representations of the great works of painterly propaganda which Lebrun carried out for Louis XIV. You can see the conquest of the Franche-Comté from the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles, where Lebrun painted the vault with scenes celebrating military victories. To see this side of Lebrun's work in the Louvre, we can look at these enormous paintings of the conquests of Alexander the Great, commissioned in 1673, which Louis XIV would have interpreted as an allegory of his own military prowess and nobility. These paintings flattered the king by analogy. It may seem surprising that these examples of royal patronage were given pride of place in the new Central Museum during the French Revolution. In complete contrast, the full-size bronze statue of the king by the sculptor Girardon, of which this is the study, was demolished during the Revolution, along with many explicit celebrations of royal authority. The reason the Lebrun paintings survived was because they were allegorical. The virtues of Alexander which they extolled could be detached from the king and be seen as universal examples of heroism and courage. Lebrun's heads were based on his comparative study of the depiction of emotions. It was the ability of art to convey complex emotional states, Lebrun claimed, which set art above poetry. By the mid-18th century, the very theories of high art which had been developed by the Royal Academy began to be used against King Louis XV and his court. Critics began to assert that the king's collection was too important to be hidden away in the royal palaces. The king had a duty to raise the level of public taste by putting on show the best works of the past. So, how was the taste of the court challenged by a new public? As early as 1699, the Royal Academy organized a public exhibition in the Louvre, and this was the origin of the regular public exhibitions which came to be known as the Salon. From 1737, regular exhibitions of work in the Salon Carré were reintroduced, and it was the public admission to these exhibitions which allowed for the circulation of criticisms of royal painters. Serious critics began to accuse the royal painters of debasing the classical tradition and producing erotic, frivolous art for the courtiers. Artists like Boucher pandered successfully to these tastes and became extremely wealthy. This criticism took on strong political overtones. Many of the king's political opponents supported those critics who argued that art was too important to be left to court patronage. It was in this atmosphere that the young Jacques-Louis David carved out a reputation for himself. His large, severe paintings took subjects from antique pre-imperial Rome, proclaiming republican virtues. With their imposing scale and dramatic compositions, They were designed to dominate the competition in the salon. As the imagination of the public was caught by this spectacle of artistic conflict, and as the profession of art critic grew in importance, the salon came to play a significant and potentially destabilizing role in Parisian society. But before the Crown could take action to meet its critics, the events of 1789 changed everything. With the execution of the king in January 1793, the decision was taken to make the royal collection accessible to all, and this happened on the 10th of August. After 1793, the collection was expanded with confiscations from churches and aristocratic families. Michelangelo's slaves had been in the possession of French aristocrats since the 17th century and were confiscated during the Revolution. They quickly became star attractions in the new Central Museum. Fra Bartolomeo's mystic marriage of St. Catherine had belonged to the Church of Notre Dame in Autun. Another category of works which came into the Louvre were those reception pieces submitted to the Academy by academicians. This is Watteau's Île de Cithère. The first real director of the Musée Central at the Louvre was the engraver and art collector Vivant Denon. The present director of the Louvre, Pierre Rosenberg, considers Denon's contribution to have been essential.
What was his great idea in a certain way? It's a very simple idea. First, to open the museum to everyone and to make it a sort of democratic institution. There were examples before, but the idea was not works of art hanging together, chosen by the taste of the ruler, of the prince, but trying to explain through work of art the history of art. That means the schools, the division in Northern School, Italian School, French School, the chronology. From Giotto you go to Masaccio, and from Masaccio to Leonardo da Vinci, and from there to Caravaggio, and so on and so on. I mean, this idea of an evolution of art history.
And Denon soon had enormously more to work with to create his history of art. In addition to the King's collections, the Central Museum was swelled by an unheard-of booty, the product of a systematic policy of trophies of conquest extracted from the defeated nations of Europe. To measure the extraordinary completeness of these acquisitions, you only have to look at Panini's representation of the treasures of ancient Rome, painted in 1758, 40 years before Napoleon's conquest of Italy. Almost all the famous antique sculptures depicted here, to see which generations of artists and cognoscenti had had to travel to Rome, were crated up and dispatched to Paris by art historians travelling with Napoleon's armies. In the Louvre, the best works of sculpture were displayed along a suite of galleries with, in pride of place at the end, the most extraordinary of the ancient treasures, the Laocoon. It was almost as if Rome itself, with its 2,000-year-old history, had been transported to Paris. In this extraordinary painting, Hubert Robert imagined how the Grand Gallery would look in ruins after some future cataclysm. We can see some of the new acquisitions lying around, being rediscovered anew by artists and archaeologists. An artist is sketching the Apollo Belvedere, while in another corner, one of Michelangelo's slaves lies unnoticed. Works acquired by revolution or force of arms, Robert seems to be saying, could as easily be lost again in the next turn of fate. Napoleon's newly acquired art treasures were put on display all along the Grand Gallery on the occasion of his marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria. Many of Raphael's best paintings, including the Transfiguration, featured in the trophies of conquest, which doubled the Italian Renaissance collection. Further on came some spectacular Flemish works, including Rubens's Descent from the Cross, his most famous work. And these works were then compared with the best achievements of French classicism, including the huge canvas of St. Gervasius and Protasius by Le Sueur. This painting, commissioned by the Crown for the Church of Saint-Gervais in Paris, had been confiscated during the Revolution. Although most of these works had to be repatriated after the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the French managed to hang on to a significant number. An Italian collection which the French were able to keep was that of Prince Borghese, which was acquired by the marriage of Napoleon's sister. After the return of the Laocoon, the Dying Gaul, and the Apollo Belvedere, statues from the Borghese collection, such as this Dionysius and the infant Bacchus, became the most famous antiquities in the Louvre. The Borghese Gladiator, one of the most celebrated antique sculptures, which we've already seen as a model for Nicolas Cousteau and shown in pride of place on the bureau of Charles Lebrun, finally came to France with this collection. Of the Renaissance paintings confiscated in Italy, the largest was Veronese's Feast of Cana. It seems that its size prevented it being sent back to Venice in 1815. Throughout the 19th century, it had pride of place in the Salon Carré. In the case of this wonderful 14th century painting by Cimabue, which was taken from the church of San Francesco in Pisa, it's likely that the Italians were not interested enough in art of the early period to demand its return. So this is a case where military seizure may have saved the painting from destruction or neglect. This Calvary by Mantegna is a predella, that's to say, a small painting at the bottom of a larger altarpiece. The curators managed to keep the predella when the main altarpiece had to be returned to Italy. Again, Denon was ahead of the game in valuing Mantegna's work at a time when early Renaissance art was not yet in fashion. How was the Louvre adapted to meet the needs of a mass audience? After the final defeat of Napoleon, the monarchy was restored in France, and Louis XVIII, Charles X, and Louis Philippe all contributed to the decoration and completion of the buildings and the enlargement of the collection. Now, this was a time when most nation-states were founding national art museums in imitation of the Louvre, and it quickly became a matter of fierce rivalry to secure the best works. In the Louvre, the priority was to replace those crowd-pulling masterpieces which had to be returned after 1815. An early success was the so-called Venus de Milo, obtained by a mixture of diplomacy and force in 1820. This statue immediately becomes a symbol of beauty and takes a prominent place in all future organizations of the Louvre. After an undignified scramble between French, British and German agents, a magnificent collection of Egyptian antiquities was assembled by the French consul Champollion and donated in 1827. The French developed an ambitious policy of funding expensive archaeological expeditions, substituting by peaceful means for Napoleon's conquering armies. In 1847, after a high-profile archaeological expedition in Khorsabad, the first two bulls from the Palace of Sargon were installed. By the mid-century, these discoveries were no chance finds, but the products of systematic, competitive endeavor. And in 1863, the Nike of Samothrace was discovered and sent to Paris by Consul Champoiseau. The Louvre quickly established itself as a site for a number of different audiences. This is how Hubert Robert imagined the new art public when the museum was first opened. Art lovers and middle-class cognoscenti rub shoulders with foreign or provincial visitors, copyists, and art students.
This museum is paid for at public expense, and the public is freely admitted. Its purpose is to disseminate a taste for the arts and to establish their sanctuary in the French capital, also to make the government popular.
The visitors, a turbulent and unseemly mob, can best be described by the words of the psalm, "They have eyes but see not." This ignorant public has the special talent of stopping before the very worst paintings. They're either provincials or foreigners. It's rare that fashionable Parisians visit the Louvre on open days.
But this is how the realist novelist Émile Zola describes a visit by a working-class wedding party from Montmartre.
Their guide called a halt in the middle of the Salon Carré. "You'll only find masterpieces here," he whispered quietly, as if in a church. Gervaise asked for the Feast of Cana to be explained. "It's stupid not to put the story on the labels," he said. Coupeau stopped in front of the Mona Lisa, which he declared looked like one of his aunts. Bosch and Bibi Lagriade sniggered, stealing glances at the nude women. The thighs of Antiope, more than anything, sent them into paroxysms.
All our great contemporary painters have nourished their talent in this one gallery, and if they've not all been able to equal their masters, they have at least been encouraged to follow them by studying their masterpieces.
How does the Grand Louvre meet the needs of today? So throughout the 19th century, the Louvre tried to satisfy contradictory aims. To an extent, it retained the state and royal associations of the Louvre and Tuileries palaces. Until 1980, it continued to house the Ministry of Finance. The old Louvre presented the visitor with hideous circulation difficulties. There was only one entrance on the south side.
Donc Ayam Pei a pris en compte cette donnée et dit mais il faut que l'entrée soit au centre de gravité des collections, c'est-à-dire ici.
Why center of gravity? From that point, it's almost the shortest distance to the three pavilions, Richelieu, Denon, and Sully. If you put the entrance, let's say, at the center of Napoleon Court, that is the place where the entrance should be. And then people can then go down and see exactly where they are and how they should go about visiting the museum. I think the entrance to a great museum has to be appropriate to Louvre. And we simply couldn't do anything that is above ground, that is grand enough to do justice to that requirement. By excavating the Napoleon Court, we put that reception hall quite far down, 9 meters below ground. And so forth. Therefore, with the pyramid, we have a tremendous volume. That volume gives Napoleon Hall the kind of importance that it deserves.
Le Louvre, c'est le musée de Paris, c'est le grand musée de France. Je veux dire que moi, je suis allé au Japon, j'ai été frappé de voir des tours opérateurs vendre la pyramide du Louvre comme un élément incontournable du passage en Europe.
So already, this building has become a symbol of French identity. In a similar way, works which have been acquired over the years from other cultures have taken on French citizenship. To question their value is, in a sense, to challenge the authority of the state. I asked Jean Lebras if the Mona Lisa is in any way French.
Je pense que profondément française, oui. Oui. Et on n'imagine pas qu'elle parte, même en Angleterre.
The canon of works in the Louvre are here as the result of a long process of selection and rejection. Although chance and political factors played an important role in deciding what's in the Louvre, a continuing process of discrimination and debate either validates or challenges the selection, and subtly adjusts the pecking order of the canon as it's presented to the public. And this is a process to which we're all entitled to participate.
Museums are not sterilized. They are moving, they are changing, they are transforming. So when I hear saying that the Louvre will be finished in 1998, I agree with, because I have to say so. But in reality, I know perfectly well that the museum will be never finished by chance. It's a living institution, and if it would be finished, it would prove that the museum would be dead.